questions. So if you are concerned about what you want to share, be aware that this will be recorded, and take that under consideration. Let's see. We got more people joining us, so we're just going to wait another minute or two before we get started. A little bit else about my career journey. I have been a program supervisor of a group facilitation of a group therapy program. I have worked as a youth peer advocate for mental health advocates of Western New York. I have worked as a program assistant in a clinic setting. I have also worked as a behavioral health staff in residential settings. And this year, I recently co-founded a domestic violence and interpersonal violence nonprofit called Now She Speaks. So that's just a little bit about my career background, and I'm really happy to be able to provide this training today. So I'd like to just jump in and get started now. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to go right in. Okay. All right, everyone. So this is Youth Peer Advocate Crisis Intervention, or what I like to say, YPA CI. Really flows off the tongue easy. So when we're talking about crisis intervention, it's not technically the role of a YPA to provide crisis intervention. It's not technically in our job description. However, we're often in positions where we are managing a crisis. We are supporting a youth through intense emotions, or depending on where we work, we might be expected to be a support in a crisis situation. So these are some skills we definitely want to be informed on and be able to be confident in managing a crisis situation. All right, so what is a crisis? A crisis is a situation where the individual is experiencing extreme distress, causing emotional, behavioral, and mental dysregulation. Dysregulation can be the inability to cope with what we're experiencing, and we can be behaving in unhealthy or maladaptive ways. There are a variety of types of crisis situations, and they can range in severity depending on the circumstances of the situation, how the person is responding, and the safety of the situation. Some examples of crisis situations include, but are not limited to, a youth overdosing, a youth who is homeless, a youth who is being abused, a youth who is violent, a youth who is actively self-harming, a youth that has suicidal intentions, and a youth that is simply experiencing a very intense emotion to the point where they're not able to function. And oftentimes when we think of someone experiencing overwhelmingly intense emotions, we label this as a breakdown. But I want us to try and branch away from that term, because a breakdown, that term is very vague, and we can't label what someone else is experiencing for them. We want them to self-identify. So there's a variety of different emotions that someone can experience during a crisis. We have a sense of hopelessness and helplessness, like they're not going to be able to get through it. Oftentimes we have shame and guilt based on the behaviors that we're demonstrating during the crisis. We can feel powerless and out of control of our emotions, and that can be a really stressful and overwhelming experience. And feeling out of control leads to more shame and guilt. So there's a lot of different emotions that we have to manage and support a youth while they're experiencing a crisis. So I'd like to open up the floor for any conversations. You can put it in the chat, or you can just raise your hand and I'll call on you to speak out loud. But I'd like you guys to briefly answer these questions. How have you personally managed a youth crisis? How did you support a youth through a crisis? What was the youth experiencing? How did you know they were in a crisis? What were they saying, feeling, and what were they behaving? And then lastly, how did you support them? What techniques did you use? What did you say? How did you show them that you cared? We can just take a moment to share a little bit about that. Does anyone have experience supporting someone through a crisis? Well, I'll share a little bit then. No worries. So, we have in the chat, listen without judgment and validating feelings, regardless on whether you agree with their behaviors and action. Absolutely. One of the things we want to remember is we don't have to agree with the youth to provide support and validate their experience 100%. And listening without judgment it can be difficult to do because we might have these automatic thoughts and automatically labeling and assuming information. So we want to challenge our first thoughts and have our second thought be non-judgmental. Any other feedback on how we've managed a crisis? So one of the ways that I have managed a crisis is by simply listening, just really actively listening to the person as they continue to vent and share. And even when I think they're done sharing and they're just quiet for a minute, I still don't respond right away. I still give them more opportunity to continue to express themselves. And that's something that I do in every single type of crisis situation, is just allowing the youth to thoroughly express themselves, even after an awkward silence, and still giving them opportunity to share. So there's different stages of a crisis. And this is the stress model of a crisis, which shows the degree of stress a youth is experiencing associated to each stage of a crisis. The pre-crisis state or baseline is the behavioral, mental, and emotional state a youth is in on a regular basis. This is their daily activities, how they feel, interact, their daily thoughts, and just how they are in regular calm behavior. A triggering event is a situation that causes the youth to become distressed. This could be a trigger, something that reminds them of a previous trauma. It could also be someone's behaviors or words that really, really upset them and cause the youth to feel intense emotions such as anger, sadness, hopelessness, anxiety, fear, or shame. So let's say a youth gets into an argument with their father, and based on what the father said, the youth feels at an extreme level of shame. This can lead to a crisis because that youth might end up behaving in unhealthy coping skills to manage that shame. So a triggering event can also be a situation that causes extreme distress or discomfort. So let's say that someone has a social anxiety and gets overwhelmed in crowds. If they go to an amusement park, even with a group of friends, that might be an anxiety-provoking situation for them. And at some point, they might experience an anxiety attack because they're so overwhelmed and overstimulated. So a triggering event is not necessarily a trauma trigger. It can be situations, it can be arguments, it can be statements, it can be an emotional feeling that someone is experiencing. The escalation phase is when a youth becomes progressively more upset or agitated, and they're struggling to manage their emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. Some examples of behaviors might include a youth yelling or threatening others, threatening to hurt themselves, damaging property, gathering the items to cause harm. They might become withdrawn and minimally respond to others, so they're really not engaging in the support that you're trying to offer. Or they might begin to excessively cry, and this excessive crying is almost uncontrollable. It's extensive. Even after they've received support, they're still crying and they're struggling to just regulate their body's response. Next, we have the outburst stage. And this is when a youth is in survival mode. The survival part of their brain, the animalistic part of their brain, has taken over. And whatever situation they might be in, they're determined to get through it the victor. And that's based on the survival brain, is we just want to end up getting through the situation without causing harm to ourselves. And sometimes with that mindset will cause harm to others. And it's all simply based on the survival brain. So when a youth is in this stage, they're behaving in an extreme way based on that survival. And this is because the youth is experiencing extreme emotional distress that is overwhelming and causes an inability to function. And that's something I really want us to remember, is when a youth is experiencing a crisis, they are unable to function appropriately. And we have to have compassion for their behaviors when they're experiencing this crisis. And lastly, the recovery phase is when the youth is receiving support and their intense response is steadily de-escalating. The youth is able to calm down, they're communicating in an appropriate manner and able to express themselves clearly. They're starting to regulate their intense emotions and they're beginning to function again. And the goal of the recovery stage is for the youth to feel safe, to feel in control, to understand what the triggering event was, and to be able to manage their emotions. It's also important to help the youth develop a healthy coping plan for if they experience the trigger again. And that can be done through conversation. And sometimes that coping plan is going to work, and other times it's not. But as a YPA, we are coaching that skill building process and helping them to identify what they can do to manage their intense emotions, because the emotions aren't going to go away. We got to learn how to manage them. Before I move on to the next slide, does anyone have any questions on the stress model of crisis? Okay. All right, so when we are managing a crisis, our self is a tool. We have skills and characteristics that help us to support this youth on a much more personal level. So how we use ourselves in supporting a youth can make a significant impact on the quality of support we are able to provide. And our goal is to provide the highest quality of support we can. Effective use of ourself requires skills in several key areas, including self-awareness, self-regulation, attunement with the youth's experiences, relationship building, communication skills, and self-care. Consider how your past experiences, personal beliefs, and feelings might impact how you interact with the youth and their family. Do you have any personal biases or narrow-sighted beliefs that can cause you to struggle to understand where this youth is coming from, or become a challenge for you to understand how the situation is impacting a youth because you've never experienced the same situation? So we want to consider how these might impact us. You want to make sure to learn coping skills to regulate your own emotions and thoughts if you are triggered. That's really important because you could be triggered, you might become angry, or you could become very sad by what the youth is expressing. However, we don't want to convey our emotions to the youth, because then the youth can start to internalize that and they can have a variety of responses. A very common response that a youth performs when they see the provider experiencing distress based on what they're saying is the youth will stop sharing because they feel guilty and they don't want to cause you to be upset and they're now uncomfortable. So it's really important to remain composed and have neutral body language. And we're going to get a little bit more into that in a minute. So when a youth is expressing this, it's important to develop a positive relationship with them that is based on trust and safety, because this will cause the youth to feel more comfortable with receiving support from you as opposed to receiving support from a stranger. Because of developing a relationship with the youth, you might have also learned unique styles of support that best help that youth, because every youth receives support differently. And you also will be able to learn how this youth copes. What are the unique coping skills that this youth has identified works for them? You want to be conscious of how your body language may be perceived. And we also want to be aware of our verbal paralinguistics. Paralinguistics is the style of your vocal communication, such as your tone, your pitch, your volume, the speed of how you're speaking, the fluency, any pauses, any silences, and also vocalizations, any noises that you might make. These paralinguistics are a form of nonverbal communication. However, they can really indicate how you're feeling. So if you're frustrated, but your face is composed, but you have an attitude in your tone, the youth is going to pick up on that. So we want to make sure we're monitoring our body language and our paralinguistics, not just what we are verbally saying. All right, more use of self. There are 5 questions that we should reflect on when supporting a youth for a crisis. You want to consider, what are you personally feeling in that moment? Are you calm, frustrated, anxious, or maybe triggered? How are your thoughts and emotions impacting how you respond to the youth? It's really important to take that under consideration because we want to regulate ourselves to provide the best quality of support. Next is, how do you want the youth to experience you during the crisis? Are you able to provide a sense of safety, acceptance, comfort, and concern? Or are your personal thoughts and feelings causing you to display frustration, anxiety, or sadness? And again, remember your paralinguistics. Your tone of voice can give away a lot of how you're feeling. So you want to make sure you understand what the youth is feeling and thinking. You want to be attuned to that. Listen without judgment or assumptions. Consider what feelings or situations might be causing the youth's behavior. Why is the youth experiencing this, as opposed to focusing on their current behavior as a problem? Consider what feelings or situations might be causing this, and try to determine how the youth prefers to be supported and what they need from you in that moment. And if you're not sure how to support that youth or what they need, ask them, how can I help you? How can I best support you? What do you need from me? Depending on the state of the youth, they might not know. They might feel like a deer in the headlights, or they might be aware of what they need and they just want to talk, or they need help, they need a solution, and they'll be able to express that to you. If the youth doesn't know how to be, like, what they need and how they want to be supported, actively listen, encourage them to share more, and then you can make a decision on how you're going to support them. And we're going to get more into some techniques that you can do. So we also want to consider environmental factors that can influence the youth during a crisis. Is the youth overwhelmed by a crowded area? Does the youth feel unsafe in a specific location? What is your proximity to the youth? What is the proximity of other people to the youth? Because that body language, again, can make a difference. Any noises or bright lights can cause the youth to feel stressed during a crisis because they're overstimulated. I think of a situation where a youth was in a semi-crowded place, but it was just too much. And when she started to experience anxiety, she was very overwhelmed and worried that other people were going to see her. So we had to remove her from that environment and find more of a quiet, secluded area for her to be able to calm down. Otherwise, the crisis would have continued to escalate, and then there's people watching her. And that can be really overwhelming when you're experiencing a moment of vulnerability. So if the environment is not catering to the youth and their needs to be safe and calm, remove the youth from that environment. Offer to take them for a walk. If you're in a crowded place, is there a bathroom that you can go to? Are you able to step outside? Think about these things that you can do to remove them from that stressful environment. And as previously mentioned, a feeling of trust and safety can really help a youth feel comfortable during a crisis. Your knowledge of the youth, their needs, their coping skills, and their strengths can help you determine the best strategies to de-escalate a youth. So these questions might not come automatically. You might not remember to ask, okay, these are the 5 questions. This is how I got to assess myself in the situation. However, I'd like you guys to consider going over these and think about this when you're in a situation. Even if you don't remember the specific questions, think about, how am I feeling? How is the youth feeling? How do I want to respond to the youth? And what tools can I use to support this youth? All right, and that leads us into our next slide, which is the specific steps to take during a crisis. So ALGE is an acronym that we can use to have an action plan to manage a crisis. This acronym comes from Mental Health First Aid Certification, which is published in, I think the most recent update was 2017, but don't quote me at that, it's in my references. So the first step is to assess the risk of suicide or harm to self or others. Next, we want to listen non-judgmentally, which was already mentioned in the chat. Love it. We want to listen non-judgmentally to the youth so you can have a thorough understanding of what they are experiencing. No assumptions, no conclusions, no trying to think that the youth might be experiencing this because you experienced something similar. None of that. We want to focus on exactly what the youth is expressing. Next, we want to give reassurances and comfort and encourage the youth to use coping skills. And if it's appropriate, because it's not always going to be appropriate, we want to educate the youth on what they might be experiencing, such as identifying it as an anxiety attack or asking them if something might have triggered them, or giving them information about a mental illness symptom. Now, again, this might not always be appropriate. However, if an individual is aware that they have a mental illness and that this can affect them, some youth might gain skills if they become self-aware. It can help them to regulate. So we also want to encourage professional help, such as seeking a counselor or a support group. Not all youth are receptive to this, so determine that based on your relationship with the youth. And lastly, we want to encourage the youth to practice coping skills that they've identified work for them. And this is going to be very strength-based. This youth knows what works for them. And if they don't know what coping skills work for them, then encourage them to explore these things, not only during a crisis, but also in their personal time when they're calm, so they can start to develop their own coping skills plan. So we're going to take a closer look at each of these steps. All right, first, we're assessing for risk of suicide or harm. There are 3 categories that we have to assess for: intent, means, and a plan. The youth's intention indicates a strong desire to cause harm to themselves or another person. Intentions can be expressed through verbal threats or body language. The means to harm includes what tools or items a youth might use. If a youth is violent, they might use objects around them to cause harm. If a youth is suicidal, they might use a pencil sharpener or razor to harm themselves. If the youth has the means to cause harm, we want to prioritize removing that item from the youth or encouraging the youth to leave the environment where that tool is. And lastly, a plan to harm themselves or someone is a determining factor on if the youth follows through with the intent and means. A youth can have intent and means, yet has decided not to act on their feelings. Assessing if the youth's intent, means, and plan will help you determine the best course of action in supporting a youth. Because if the youth has intent, means, and plan, that's above your role. You might not know how to manage that situation. You might not have the skills or the training to manage that situation appropriately. It could be a violent situation, it could be a very traumatic situation, and it could be a very triggering situation. So one of the things that I want to remind us of is that we are not the first responders to a crisis. That is not our role. We are a support during a crisis. So if you've assessed for intent, means, and plan, and you've determined that this youth has all three, contact your superior or contact the person who is the primary support for that crisis situation. Because at that point, it's off your hands and you don't want to take responsibility for something that is not in your role. All right, moving right along. Listen non-judgmentally. There's a lot to this, more so than we expect. Listening non-judgmentally is crucial to establishing a relationship of trust, safety, and acceptance. We want to be intentional in using active listening skills, such as rephrasing what is shared with us, putting it in our own words, reflecting what the youth is saying, so repeating what they said back to them to make sure we have a thorough understanding, and ask questions that require a thorough response as opposed to a yes or no answer. Instead of asking, are you triggered? Ask them, did something trigger you? What might have triggered you? So that way they can identify a trigger as opposed to just saying yes or no. Body language includes a variety of nonverbal signals, such as our facial expressions, our gestures, our posture, eye contact, physical touch, the proximity, and our paralinguistics. So when we're supporting a youth through a crisis, we want to manage our body communication, our body language, so that we are calm, open, and we're considerate to the youth's needs. Youth who are experiencing a crisis are highly attuned to the other person's response and behaviors. And that's why it is so important for us as a YPA or any provider to be conscious of how we are being perceived by that youth. How can your proximity to the youth impact them? Because if you enter their personal space, depending on the situation, that could trigger the youth. So we want to keep that in mind. Next, I already mentioned a little bit about silence, but I want us to use silence to our advantage. That awkward silence, uncomfortable, no one's talking, it's a good thing. You can use that. It's not something we have to fill right away with words. So don't be quick to respond to a youth when they finish speaking. This gives the youth time to collect their thoughts and reflect on what they're feeling. Frequently, youth will feel compelled to continue to express themselves because they are uncomfortable with the silence and they want to fill the space. Silence also gives you an opportunity to think about how you want to respond in order to support the youth best. And you want to be genuine in your support. Have empathy for what the youth is experiencing. Even if you haven't experienced something similar, put yourself in their shoes. Regardless on if you agree or you think it was rational or appropriate, we want to fully accept what the youth is experiencing and really understand it from their point of view. We want to validate the emotions and thoughts that they are experiencing, even if we don't agree. And lastly, we want to practice radical acceptance. Radical acceptance is greater than simply acceptance. When we accept something, we're like, yeah, we accept it, it is what it is, and we're a little bit more casual about it. But when we are radically accepting something, we are 100 entirely accepting something and almost embracing it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a positive embracing. It can be embracing the fact that this is the situation and not fighting it, avoiding it, or feeling negative about it. So we want to make a conscious effort to acknowledge and respect the youth without judgments, without assumptions or frustrations. So sometimes we do have that automatic first thought that could be an assumption or a judgment, and that's okay. It's natural for our brains to have automatic thoughts. What's important is your second thought. Is your second thought going to challenge that judgment? Are you talking to yourself in a positive way that's going to help you support the youth? So sometimes we can't control that first thought, but our second thought is going to be what demonstrates our radical acceptance. All right, give reassurance and information. Empathy and validation is also an aspect of giving reassurance. It is not simply an aspect of listening non-judgmentally. Youth who are experiencing a crisis may feel insecure, anxious, overwhelmed, and oftentimes out of control. We want to give the youth positive affirmations to reinforce a sense of safety, control, confidence, and hope. And we want to make sure our language is person first by emphasizing the youth before describing a disability or a mental health symptom. We also don't want the youth to feel labeled by a disability or an illness. And that's why I said earlier, you have to use your best judgment on if you're going to give information regarding a mental health symptom or what they might be experiencing, because that can have a positive response or it could have a negative response. Keeping your language strength-based too by identifying the positive qualities of the youth and reminding them of their goals or encouraging them to use their coping skills is also important. And always, always, always be patient with the youth on what they're experiencing. Sometimes youth get into a cycle of negative behaviors and a cycle of intense emotions, and it's very, very hard to break out of that cycle. And as youth, they haven't practiced these skills for years like we might have as adults. So we want to be increasingly patient with this youth who is stuck in a cycle of negative behavior or intense negative emotions, and we don't want to judge that. So during a crisis, youth might express their emotions through extreme behaviors that might be frustrating and overwhelming. Want to remember to be patient and self-regulate, use your own coping skills, remain calm and composed, and avoid giving advice. You don't want to tell this youth how to resolve their challenge. You want to allow the youth to process their experience and develop solutions themselves. You want to give the power back to the youth. We don't have to be their savior. We want to be their cheerleader. So lastly, some youth benefit from self-awareness related to mental health crisis, and this self-awareness can help them to understand why they are distressed and manage their emotions. Any questions, feedback before I continue forward? All right, then we have encourage professional help. So we want to encourage the youth to use professional supports. If the youth is actively harming themselves or others, you'll have to consider if it's appropriate to call the police. And this would be if the youth requires high needs medical attention, or if the youth is violent beyond the point that they are able to de-escalate. After a youth has calmed down and reached the recovery stage, you can encourage the youth to contact with other professional supports. So some professional supports that we can encourage a youth to use: 911 for immediate danger. If this youth has engaged in drugs or self-harming behaviors, or if they have actively injured someone else or is using items to injure someone else, that might be cause of concern that is beyond your capabilities to manage. It might be appropriate to call the police. However, we need to remember that calling the police can be a trigger, and it can also continue to escalate the situation. So if you are alone and there is no other people supporting you during this crisis, and the youth is exceedingly violent and in need of medical attention or someone else's, then it is up to you to call the police. However, if there are other people there who are first responders on handling this crisis, defer to them. They're the ones who are in charge and the lead. So then we have 988, which is the National Crisis Services Hotline. You can contact this service for anything. It doesn't have to be suicidal. It doesn't have to be for a specific trauma. It could be you're feeling extremely hopeless and alone and you want someone to talk to. It could be you're having an anxiety attack and you don't know how to manage. It could be that you just had a major argument with your father and you feel so ashamed of yourself and you're really struggling to navigate that intense emotion. 988 is a resource for any mental health or substance use concern. Community resource linkage. As YPAs, we want to encourage youth to develop relationships with community services and other healthy supports. So look into what community services are local to this youth. Are there any clubhouse programs? A clubhouse program is a group therapy program for youth. Are there any boys and girls clubs? Is there any big sister, big brother programs in the area? Are there any recreational groups that this youth can join? Consider what community resources you can link them to that can help them develop the skills and improve on their goals to be successful. Encourage them to talk to the school counselor. These youth are in school throughout the week. They spend many hours there and they might struggle with that. There's school-related stressors too. Encourage them to talk to the school counselor. You might feel apprehensive about it, maybe embarrassed. They don't want to miss class. And this is where we want to reinforce that a school counselor is a safe and healthy support. Okay, so this will definitely be the opportunity to do that. And then you have a therapist. You want them to have a primary therapist. However, therapy is not for everyone. So if you already know that this youth is not, if they don't have a positive perception of therapy, then don't encourage that. However, if they are actively in therapy, you can encourage them to talk to their therapist about what they just experienced or expressed. And if they're not in therapy, but haven't expressed any negative feelings related to therapy, then you might want to suggest that. And if you're going to suggest therapy, explain the benefits and what they can gain by speaking to a therapist. Support groups. I highly recommend support groups for these youth. It can be a neutral environment where they can connect with other peers who might be experiencing similar situations. And they're also going to develop a community and coping skills. And then there's medication. Only if a youth is prescribed medication should you encourage the use of medication. If a youth is prescribed a PRN, which is an emergency pill that they can take to regulate their emotions, then during a crisis, that would be a good opportunity to encourage them to use their PRN. However, if they are not prescribed that, do not encourage any use of medications. All right, moving right along. So the next step is encouraging self-help and support strategies. And there are a variety of different ways that we can do this and a variety of different activities we can provide and suggest to this youth. So there's these different types of coping skills a youth can use to express themselves, to regulate themselves, and then to manage their emotions. Grounding techniques help the youth stay present in the moment by engaging their senses in the environment. For example, if you want to use the 5 senses, you can play this little game. So 5 things they can see of the same color, 4 things that they can touch that are different textures, 3 things that they can hear, 2 things that they can smell, and 1 thing that they can taste. This focuses the brain away from the stress response of the nervous system and causes the brain to focus on the senses and the nerve endings of that sense. So redirecting the brain and the nervous system can help de-escalate a situation. So then we have self-soothing techniques, and this can be anything that comforts the youth, anything. It can be hugging a stuffed animal, putting on a blanket and a coat. It could be having a cup of tea. It might be stress toys, anything that provides that sense of comfort to them. So sometimes a youth simply needs to express and release the emotions that they're struggling with. They just need to get it out. They need to vent. They need to exert the tension that's in their body. Some strategies of healthy expression might be writing poetry, exercising, creative expressions such as music, drawing, or painting. Another thing that we can provide to the youth is if the youth is already involved in a religious community, you can encourage them to seek support from spiritual leaders, and that can be a benefit. However, if this youth is not already involved in a religious community, I don't suggest encouraging this unless the youth has identified that they are religious and they seek comfort in their religious views. There are many different perspectives regarding religion and religious views, so we want to honor that youth's culture and their personal views. So then if you are going to focus on problem solving, identifying the problem of the crisis, what triggered it, and then providing a solution for going forward. For example, I'm going to use that argument again. The argument is a problem because the youth is not respecting the father as the father wishes. Now we want to identify a solution. We don't want to give the youth the solution. We want to encourage and coach the youth to identify solutions themselves instead of telling them what they should do. And you can do this by waiting. You can offer some suggestions and ask them what would work for them. Ask them what they're comfortable with. Another thing that you can do is ask them what they have done in the past to manage these situations. So going back to my example, we might consider a solution is communicating effectively. Let's say that the youth had a tone and was swearing at her father. Well, now we want to practice healthy communication because the youth had a valid reason to be upset, but she wasn't communicating it appropriately. So we might suggest that, hey, have you tried expressing it this way? Or maybe in the past, you expressed yourself to your dad when you were upset and it worked. What did you do then that you didn't do now? So really encourage them to identify solutions, but also coach them, give them suggestions, give them the opportunity. Next, we have mindfulness activities such as meditation, visualizations, and breathing exercises. These might work for some youth, but not all youth. And what I would encourage everyone to do after this is to look up some different mindfulness activities on YouTube. My favorite mindfulness activity is a safe place visualization. And that is where you close your eyes and you start to visualize an environment that makes you feel safe and you focus on all 5 senses. So for an example, your safe place can be a favorite memory. It can be a favorite location that you've been to, or it could be something made up. So for an example, my safe place is in a bathtub in the middle of the woods next to a campfire, and there's a little creek and it's nighttime and I hear the sounds of owls and deer and little like critters going around, and I see some bats and the stars. My safe place is very specific because I've been developing it since I was a teenager, and it doesn't necessarily make sense that there's a bathtub in the middle of the woods, but that's my safe place. And doing that visualization helps to soothe me when I'm experiencing intense emotions. And I learned that on YouTube. So I would definitely encourage you to go onto YouTube and look up different calming strategies so you know what you can suggest to a youth. And then we always want to encourage the youth to prioritize developing their own hobbies, passions, and using these as a coping skill. If a youth is really passionate about reading, suggest that as a coping skill. It's a distraction method, and distraction methods can be just as effective. If they are really passionate about sports, encourage them to watch some sports or to go outside and practice some moves or to engage in exercise, which is going to benefit their athletic career. We really want these youth to develop their own hobbies and be able to fall back on what's going to make them feel happy and passionate. Any questions on the 5 steps of algae before I move forward? Can definitely review anything. All right, traumatic event response. A youth who has just experienced a traumatic event is in an extremely vulnerable position. They might be experiencing intense fear, complete shock, rage, despair, or numbness. We think back to the 4 responses of a threat. We have fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And for those of you who are not familiar with fawn, fawn is when we try to appease and subdue the threat. We want to make it happy. We want to do what it wants us to do. We are going to accommodate and become submissive to the threat. Fight is when we are going to fight this threat. We're going to go toe to toe. We're going to do whatever we can to be stronger than whatever the threat is. Flight, we're going to run away. We're going to escape the environment. We're getting away from the threat. And then freeze is when we're experiencing that shock or numbness, and we don't have a specific response to the threat. So when we are supporting a youth who has just experienced a trauma, we need to remember that they are still in one of those 4 stages. Even if they're not displaying the behaviors outwardly, they're mentally still in that survival mode. And how we support a youth who has just experienced a trauma can make a significant impact on how they process and remember the trauma. And I can say from personal experience, how one person supported me when I was 14, I still remember that. And I still appreciate how that staff engaged with me and listened to me and made me feel safe after I was just not safe. This person made me feel safe and secure and gave me just a little bit of hope that I wasn't going to always be unsafe. So how you respond and support a youth after a traumatic event leaves a lifelong impression. So first, we want to ensure the youth is uninjured and in a safe and calm environment. Let's say that you've been called, you're part of a YPA crisis support team and you collaborate with the police department, right? And now there's been a crisis, there's been a domestic dispute, and there's a child in the house. You have gone to the house with the police and the child is still crying and upset while the police are talking to the parents. If you have permission, it might be safe to remove the child out of the house and talk on the porch. If not, maybe go to the bedroom, to the youth's bedroom, and talk to them there so they're separate from the parents' conversation. So we want them to be in a safe and calm environment. Be consistent with your support by remaining next to them. Please avoid leaving this youth alone. If you have to step out of the room and you have to consult with one of the other providers around, tell that youth that you will be back in 5 minutes or less and stick to that time because they're keeping track of it, not you. So reassure them, avoid leaving them alone. If you can call a staff member into the room as opposed to leaving the room, that would be preferred. If you need to leave, if your shift is done, if the police are leaving, if whatever crisis has been resolved, you want to inform them of when you will see them next or who will see them next. So that way the youth knows that there is more support coming, even though they are not actively being supported in that moment. Reassure the youth that they are safe and cared for and valued. After a traumatic experience, nobody feels safe. Some people might feel like they're worthless and that they have no value. It depends on the situation. So we want to provide that positive reassurance. Be attentive to the youth's physical, mental, and emotional state. You want to do your best to support the youth and de-escalate them before they reach the crisis or outburst stage. After a traumatic event, they are in the escalation, okay? Maybe they've already reached crisis, or maybe the traumatic event has happened and they've calmed down a little bit, but they could still easily escalate. So we want to monitor them and try to de-escalate things before they reach another crisis situation. We want to stimulate the senses. Again, the 5 senses bring us back to the present moment. It brings comfort, normalcy, and it grounds them. It gives the brain something to focus on besides the traumatic experience. If the caregivers are safe, you want to inform the caregivers that the youth has just experienced a trauma. If the caregivers are not safe or you have concerns about how the caregivers would respond, you want to speak with your supervisor immediately and receive direction from them. As a peer, we might feel compelled to share our own experiences with the youth in order to inspire hope for this youth to overcome the trauma. However, I want you guys to know that this is not the time to strategically self-disclose. If you self-disclose after a youth has experienced a trauma, it can cause the youth to feel invalidated, and they might start to compare their trauma to yours. And we don't want them to do that. We don't want trauma comparisons, because then that youth can start to invalidate themselves and decide that their trauma isn't important enough to share. So that's why we don't want to strategically share in this moment. Maybe at a later date when it's more appropriate, but during the crisis situation, 100% on them, focused on them, no sharing. And lastly, we want to develop a restoration plan and a safety plan with the youth. A restoration plan is a self-care plan, which is different from a safety plan. And a self-care plan, or the restoration plan, is a plan of activities the youth will do for the rest of the day or night. And these activities should be focused on calming the youth, things that comfort the youth, self-soothing and distracting methods. After the youth has experienced the trauma and they're no longer receiving that professional support, we don't want them to necessarily continue to express the distress alone. Because when they're alone and expressing the emotions, they're going to escalate and spiral, and then they'll have another crisis. If that happens, we're going to provide them with support through the safety plan. However, the restoration plan is meant to soothe, calm, and distract. Now, a safety plan is a list of actions a youth can take if they are experiencing intense emotions and potentially a crisis. A safety plan includes a variety of coping strategies, such as self-care activities, but it also lists other information, such as healthy ways to cope with the emotion, a list of trusted supports that the youth can call, safe locations that the youth can go to. Depending on the age of the youth, they might be able to walk to a park that's close by, and that's a safe location. Or if they have a family member that lives locally, they might be able to call up that family member and go to that person's house. So identifying safe locations. And then also a list of professional supports the youth can call. Your number should not be number 1. You are not the primary crisis intervention support. Your number can be number 3. The first number should be the youth's primary counselor. The second number can be 988. The third number can be you. And the fourth number can be any other professional supports available. So keep that in order when you're identifying a list of professional supports. You're not number 1, you're number 3. All right. Now I want to go into different types of crisis situations. So first, we have a crisis situation where a youth is intoxicated. If a youth is intoxicated, we have to adjust our approach to their mental state, because they are not in a mental state where they're thinking clearly, concisely, and rationally. So if the youth is unresponsive, we can't use our regular steps. We have to use a different plan. However, if the youth is responsive, we can use the steps of algae to support the youth. Determine the youth's readiness to talk based on their ability to maintain a clear and structured thought. If the youth is not able to maintain a clear and structured thought, they're not communicating effectively, then doing the steps of algae might not be beneficial because it's not going to help them to calm down from that high. So if they are responsive, determine the readiness for them to talk. And then you can also express your concerns openly and honestly without judgment or assumptions about the youth's choice to use substance as a coping skill. I want us to identify coping skills as healthy or unhealthy. But regardless on if it's healthy or unhealthy, it is still a coping skill. Substance use is not simply an addiction. It is coping with mental illness. It is coping with trauma. It is coping with high levels of stress. So when we're addressing someone who is under the influence or someone who is struggling with addiction, remember to look past the addiction and identifying and recognizing what is leading to the addiction. What is the roots of it? So then we want to acknowledge the youth's experiences that have motivated them to rely on a substance, even if we don't agree with that coping skill, even if we don't want them to be using a substance, we want to validate their motivation to use that substance. Even if it's a very sad and difficult motivation, we still want them to feel validated and heard. So then we want to spend time talking with the youth and engaging them in calming activities. This is not the time to be able to process the situation. They're not going to have the right mental state to be able to work through it. And we don't want them to feel confronted or have a negative response because you're trying to do anything supportive, but they're not in the mental state to receive that. So we just want to have more casual conversation that's more calming and soothing. We also want to develop a restoration plan for the youth to engage in. And if it is safe to do so, inform the youth's caregivers that the youth is using substances and discuss the best plan that the parents can use to support the youth, because some parents might not know what to do. Again, if you feel that the parents would have a significantly negative reaction to learning that their child is or the youth is using substances, then consult with your supervisor before informing the parents. However, if you're in an environment where the youth has overdosed, then you have to inform the immediate caregivers right away. So that brings us to the next thing is if the youth has overdosed and is not responsive, we want to place them in the recovery position. The recovery position keeps airways open to ensure that any vomit or fluid is not going to cause the youth to choke. And this is so crucial. It can be life-saving. If you leave someone who has overdosed on their back, their chances of dying are highly, highly increased because now they're going to choke. And even if they're not going to vomit, fluid still comes out, and that fluid can sink back into the trachea, and that affects the airways. So this position keeps the airways open. If the youth has overdosed and is unresponsive, call the police right after you put them in the recovery position. Recovery position is always first. If there are other people around, ask someone to call the police. Do not just announce to everyone, call the police. Select a specific person, because if you just announce I need someone to call the police, then you're going to have everyone scrambling for their phones, or you're going to have everyone look into the other person, not sure who's going to take that step. You assign someone to call the police if there is no one else there. If there is other people there. If there is no one else there, you call the police while still supporting the youth. Remember that you are not a medical professional and you cannot determine the health of the youth. Even if you think the youth has an overdose, they're just unconscious. If they are unresponsive and not waking up, medical. You're not trained to assess that, and you don't want to overstep. And God forbid there is a medical need and you didn't contact support, and then something occurs that's escalated, and we don't want that. So then lastly, we have Narcan. Narcan is also known as naloxone. I think I said that right. It is a medicine that can reverse the effects of opioid drug use. It is not effective against non-opioid drugs such as alcohol. To use Narcan, you're going to place the tip of the nozzle into the youth's nose. You're going to hold it on either side. And then you're going to press the plunger, which is on the bottom, and it's going to push the Narcan nasal spray into their nose. You only have to do one nostril. Then you remove the Narcan and you wait. If the youth continues to remain unresponsive for 5 minutes, then you can administer another dose of it. You don't want to keep administering Narcan, it can overwhelm the body. So wait 5 minutes. And of course, at this point, you have already called for support. You can get Narcan for free from different substance use recovery centers. They offer them for free. So if you want to contact your local agency or your local rehabilitation center and ask if they have any free Narcan or if they have a Narcan training, highly encourage you to do that. Before we move forward, are there any questions related to what to do if a youth is intoxicated? Okay. One of the things I also wanted to point out with this recovery position is you want to stay positioned behind the youth's back. Make sure that they're staying on their sides, supporting them. If you have something to cushion their head because sometimes their head will jerk. Or if they start to vomit, this will be really significant. Their head will jerk, they're going to hit their head on the ground, and we want to avoid that. If you don't have anything to support them, position their arm underneath their head. If you position your own arm underneath them, you need to be careful on how you are holding their head, so that way it doesn't injure you and it doesn't cause harm to the youth's neck. So make sure that you're holding right on the side and try to have your palm or your fingers aligned with the temple. So then we also want to support them from the back and keep them warm and covered. If there's a blanket around, put the blanket on them. If there's another jacket, put the jacket on them. When they're overdosing, they're sweating, but their body is also extremely cold. And that's something that we want to monitor. Okay. All right, next we have if a youth is aggressive. If a youth is aggressive, the best way to not get assaulted by a youth is to stand 5 feet away from them. Best way. Do not enter their personal space whatsoever. If you're going to stand, if you're going to sit, whatever it might be, 5 feet away. This is giving that person extra personal space. And if there are other people around, try to encourage them to, why don't you give him a little bit of distance? Why don't you give him a little bit of room? Try to avoid other people approaching this youth too closely, because that again is going to be within that 5 feet. It's violating the personal space, and it's also violating the extra personal space that we're giving them. So make sure the youth has plenty of personal space and that others are respecting that too. Take all threats seriously, even if you think it's an empty threat. Take that threat as if they have the intent, the means, and a plan. Because if we don't take it seriously, then we might be caught off guard because they do have a plan and they do have intent. However, sometimes the youth is going to have an empty threat and we might not take it seriously. But what if there's that time when it wasn't empty? And that's why we need to handle every single threat as if it is 100% serious with intent, means, and plan. Ensure the safety of the youth and those in the environment. However, you never want to put yourself at risk. If you feel that you yourself are in danger, remove yourself from the situation and contact the appropriate individuals, such as a supervisor, the care team, the crisis intervention team, or the police, depending on the situation. So never put yourself at risk. Ensure the safety of the youth and those in the environment. When you are supporting an angry youth, do your best to remain calm, patient, and composed. When a youth is really, really angry and they're potentially behaving in violent ways, that can be scary. However, we don't want to show that we are afraid or anxious. So we want to work very hard to remain composed. Demonstrate this through your body language and your verbal communication. I bring this back to our tone. Our tone of voice says a lot. Consider what the youth needs in that moment. Do they need private time away from everyone? Do they need something that they can do physically to release that anger? Do they need to just vent and be listened to and just get it all out? And if you're not sure what the youth needs, again, ask them what they want. How can you best support them? What do they need right now? If a youth is actively violent, if they have already assaulted someone or assaulted themselves, consider if the violence level requires involving the authorities. Again, police can trigger youth and potentially escalate a situation. Take that under consideration before determining if calling the police is necessary. If there are other people there who are higher ranking than you when it comes to crisis intervention, let them make that decision. Again, you're just support. If you are alone with a youth and they are being violent towards another person and actively harming them, call the police, because it is not your job to manage that situation. However, if there are parents there and the parents are trying to manage the situation and the parents are working with the situation, then refer to the parents. Parents will also let you know if they feel like they can't manage the situation and that they want the police called. All right. Youth responses. So this is when we're in the recovery stage. Okay, the crisis has happened, we're steadily calming down. We're not feeling good yet, but we're not feeling as bad as we were, and we're still trying to navigate and process the experience. Once the youth has recovered from a crisis, they might respond in a few different ways. Some youth will worry that you're going to inform their caregivers of a crisis and how they behaved. If this is the youth concern, it's important to determine the root of this concern. The root makes a difference in how you're going to proceed. If the youth feels their caregiver might not understand or be able to support them effectively, provide that reassurance. Provide reassurance that the caregivers love them, want what's best for them, want them to be able to grow and heal and manage these intensities, and that most caregivers will do their best to support the youth for these challenges. However, some youth might not want their caregivers to find out because there is a risk of a caregiver having a negative reaction. A negative reaction we might associate with abusive reaction. If this is a concern, if the youth expresses it, or maybe this is a concern that you have, consult with your supervisor. Always consult with your supervisor if that's the situation. So the youth also has a right to privacy. As a youth peer advocate, you are not expected to share all of the youth's personal thoughts, feelings, and experiences with the caregiver. You're not an informant, and you don't have to overstep that boundary. However, if the youth is at risk of harming themselves or others, you must report this to the caregiver, your supervisor, and whatever the professional support might be, such as a therapist. I'm going to use an example. In my experience, I was working with a youth who had told me that she had been clean for a while from self-harming, but that she had relapsed but wasn't going to do it again. When I was in that position, in my early stages of being a YPA, I didn't end up informing the parents, and it turned out that she had not been clean and had been continuing to hurt herself throughout the several months, and that I had just caught it and learned that in the moment, but didn't know all the background. If I had informed the caregivers and the supervisor and the therapist that this youth just disclosed to me that they were self-harming, they would have immediately done a body check, and then they would have discovered the extensive amount that had been going on for that period. But because I didn't say anything, they didn't do a body check, and then a month later, they're at the doctor's office and she has all of these fresh wounds. So it's really important to report these things if the youth is at risk of harming themselves or others. So there are more ways that a youth can respond after a crisis has ended. So there is the nocebo effect. And this is when some youth might have a lack of trust or confidence in receiving professional support. This could be because of a past negative experience with professional supports. It could be because of stigma and stereotypes associated with therapy, or it might be a lack of faith in professional supports being able to support them how they need. Some youth might feel very negative about themselves and express insecurities, self-judgments, and self-hatred. If this happens, we want to validate that what they're expressing is a natural response to a stress and a crisis. Their insecurities are reasonable, their concerns are reasonable, and their judgments is something that they can work through, and their self-hatred is something that we want to overcome. But it is natural for people to experience those emotions after a crisis. Even if we don't want them to experience that, we want to validate that that is what they're experiencing. And then we can give reassurances of comfort and acknowledgement of their strengths, because we don't want them to forget the strengths. We can inspire hope by encouraging them to use that experience to grow and recover and continue. Recovery is our ultimate goal when supporting a youth for a crisis. This is the best case scenario. It's how we want things to wrap up and end. Recovery is when the youth's intense emotions become tolerable. Not that they've gone away, but they are now tolerable, and they are able to cope in a healthy manner. This is when you can have a discussion reflecting on the youth's experience, identifying the triggering event, and discussing what the youth could do next time if they experience the intense emotions again. And one thing I want us to be conscientious of is if a youth develops a strong attachment and dependency to you after you've provided crisis support. After receiving this type of quality support, a youth might begin to prefer you as their primary support for all crisis situations. For example, if your number was the first person on the list for a safety plan to call, that would be using you as the primary support, and that is an over-dependency. So we want to try and avoid that. This develops into an over-reliance for the support, which can become unhealthy for the youth and potentially violate the YPA code of ethics, because now you're providing ongoing and more support, and you're breaking your own boundaries when it comes to your work-life balance. And also we want to encourage them to use other resources. So if this happens, again, encourage the youth to utilize other coping strategies, other support individuals, and identify what works best for them. I'm not saying you can't support a youth through a crisis, but you can't be the first person to support them, and be a support ongoing. All right. So what might you experience when supporting a youth through a crisis? What emotions might you experience? What challenges might you experience? Does anyone want to briefly share or put it in the chat? Being triggered, not knowing what to do, feeling defeated. Absolutely, absolutely. Those are all natural feelings that we have when supporting someone through a crisis. Anxiety when helping in the past. The anxiety is about not getting it right or feeling like I would be able to help well enough. Yeah, we might feel a lot of pressure on ourselves to perform, and what if we say something wrong or do something wrong and it makes the youth worse? That's a very natural concern to have. Anything else? All right. So there are 4 things that I want us to be considerate of when it comes to how we feel during a crisis. So we want to be aware of triggers, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. So there are internal and external triggers. External triggers involve our 5 senses, such as a smell that reminds you of a trauma. Internal triggers are intense emotions you experience in the present moment. However, the emotion is a reaction to past experiences. For example, you might have a flashback and you might start to cry. There's nothing going on in the present moment that is motivating you to cry, but because you had a flashback, you're having that emotional response. Oftentimes, when we are supporting a youth through a crisis, we experience an internal trigger. What the youth is expressing reminds us of something that we went through, and we can start to feel those same emotions. Vicarious trauma is when you're exposed to the traumatic experiences of another person that causes you to have an intense emotional, physical, or mental response. Someone might experience vicarious trauma by having intrusive thoughts, images, or nightmares about the youth's trauma. Someone might experience bystander guilt of feeling like you are helpless and unable to support this youth, or feeling as though the youth's trauma has happened to you. So when the youth is describing their trauma or their experience of being abused, in your head, you've put yourself in their shoes and you feel like that happened to you. And that's taking it a step too far. We have to keep that separation from the youth's crisis from our own. Compassion fatigue is a combination of physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual depletion due to supporting others through an intense distress. Someone can experience this through feeling numb, unable to be empathetic, cynical, lack of purpose, or lack of fulfillment. And lastly, we have burnout. And burnout occurs when a person is unable to provide effective quality support. And burnout happens when someone is extremely dissatisfied with their work environment, that they no longer feel passionate about the work that they're doing, or when they have experienced compassion fatigue for an extended period of time. If someone has experienced compassion fatigue for 2 months in a row, that person is burnt out. It's far beyond compassion fatigue. So when we're supporting someone through a crisis, we want to be aware that these are some of the risks of what we might experience. So what do we do about this? We've experienced this, now what? Self-care, we love self-care. Self-care is the best. All right, so have a personal safety plan. A personal safety plan is a plan of action that you can take if you are triggered by a youth. First, you want to remain composed, have your neutral body language so that the youth is unaware of your personal feelings. Next, you want to try and mentally separate yourself from the youth's experiences. Utilize your own grounding techniques to keep you present in the moment and focused on engaging with the youth. You also want to encourage the youth to talk to a professional support or counselor, even just asking, hey, have you told your counselor about this? Or maybe, have you thought about talking to your counselor? Or how comfortable would you feel expressing this to your counselor? Any one of those 3 questions is encouragement. Encouragement doesn't have to necessarily be, it would be really helpful if you talk to your counselor. I don't know how well that's going to be received, but asking those questions and identifying where the youth feels comfortable is going to be really important. So utilize grounding techniques, encourage the youth to talk to professional supports. Next is remove yourself from the situation. If you are triggered, you are unable to support this youth without consequences to you or the youth. Consequences to the youth is that you might not be able to support them. You might not be able to listen to them actively. You might not be able to say the right words. You might be struggling. You might display that you are triggered and upset, and we want to avoid that. Consequences for you, now you are in a triggering moment. I'm going to share an example. So I was working with an individual who was having a very vivid flashback, and her flashback was, she was vocalizing it, and her flashback was extremely triggering for me. And unfortunately, I really struggled with removing myself from the situation, and I continued to support this youth. And at one point, I had to get out. I had to leave this youth. I gave her stuffed animals, and I walked into the office and I got my coworker and I said, someone else needs to go out. And I left work early and I had a breakdown. I stayed in a triggering situation out of obligation to support this youth, and it ended up drastically impacting my own mental health. So I highly encourage you to honor your triggers and take the appropriate action. Practice your own coping skills, inform your supervisor, and then again, try to stimulate your 5 senses, just as you would supporting another youth through the crisis. If you've been triggered, stimulate your own senses, eat something, drink something, 5 things that you can see, whatever's going to work for you. Then I'd like to use positive affirmations to reinforce our brains to think positively, to remain calm and feel secure in ourselves. Positive affirmations might not always feel genuine, but we want to still practice that because we are training our brains to think positively when we say positive affirmations, even if we don't 100% feel it. Discuss any challenges you're having with your supervisor or other coworkers who can offer support and guidance. And engage in your own healing and recovery journey by seeking professional supports. Not all of us might be working with a counselor. We might have a recovery coach. We might have a spiritual leader. We might do a lot of journaling or go to support groups. Whatever helps you in your healing recovery journey, prioritize it. And then make sure you're practicing relaxation techniques that alleviate your stress and make you feel rejuvenated. And that is our discussion on crisis intervention. So I want to open up the floor. I really want to hear your guys' thoughts and feedback. I want to know what you've learned or something you found valuable, or any questions, or maybe you want to share an experience that you were managing a crisis. Would anyone like to share? Okay. Thank you for joining us today, everyone. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in the following meetings. So thank you. And bye, everyone.